Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. I was 5 years old when all of this started. We had just moved to Florida from New Jersey, and at that age, I didn't really understand what a big change it was supposed to be. To me, it was just a new place with different trees, warmer air, and an apartment that didn't feel like the old one. It sat toward the back of a large apartment complex on the third floor, far enough from the main road that everything felt a little too quiet at night. It was just my mother and me living there. No pets, no roommates, no nearby family. Just the two of us trying to settle into a new life. At the time, I didn't know anything strange was happening. I was a kid. I played with my toys, watched cartoons, went to bed when my mom told me to, and assumed the world was exactly how it was supposed to be. It was only years later, when my mother finally told me what she experienced during that period, that I realized how unsettling those months really were. She told me that almost every single night after things got quiet and the apartment complex settled down, she would hear noises, knocking sounds, heavy banging, and movement that didn't make sense. Sometimes it sounded like someone was hitting the walls. Other times it felt like the noise was coming from inside the apartment itself, shifting from one room to another. She said she tried to convince herself it was just neighbors, pipes, or the building settling, but deep down it didn't feel right. The sounds didn't follow a pattern. They didn't come from the same direction every time. And no matter how often she checked, there was never anyone there. She didn't tell me any of this back then. She didn't want to scare me. Instead, she kept it to herself, lying awake at night, listening, tense and alert, waiting for something to happen. During the day, she acted normal, cooked meals, cleaned, and tried to give me a sense of stability. But at night, she said, the apartment felt different, heavy, like something was watching or waiting. The moment that convinced her something was truly wrong happened while she was making dinner one evening. I remember this part clearly, even though I was so young. I was in my bedroom, playing on the floor with my toys. My room had a vaulted ceiling, which made it feel bigger than it actually was. Along one wall were shelves mounted high up, near the ceiling, where my stuffed animals were kept. There was no way I could reach them on my own. Even standing on a chair wouldn't have been enough. The bedroom door was wide open. I could hear my mother in the kitchen, moving around, cooking, humming softly to herself. Everything felt normal, calm. Then, without any warning at all, the door slammed shut. Not gently, not like a draft had pushed it. It slammed hard, violently, with a force that made the sound echo through the apartment. I remember freezing, my heart racing, not understanding what had just happened. My mother heard it too. She came running down the hallway, panicked, thinking I had hurt myself or something had fallen on me. When she opened the door, she stopped cold. I was lying on my bed, completely still, and every single stuffed animal that had been neatly placed on those high shelves was now in a pile on the floor, right in the center of the room, not scattered around, not tossed randomly, piled together, as if someone had carefully placed them there. I hadn't touched them. I couldn't have reached them. And even if I somehow had, there was no explanation for how they ended up arranged that way. My mother didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't ask me what I did. She already knew. She picked me up, held me close, and didn't say much at all. That night, she barely slept. Within days, she planned a 1-week vacation just to get us out of that apartment. She said she needed time to think, to breathe, to figure out what to do next. She never told me the real reason back then, but now I understand. That wasn't the only incident, not even close. Another night, much later, something happened that still gives me chills when I think about it. My mother woke up in the middle of the night feeling thirsty and went into the kitchen to get some water. The apartment was dark and quiet, the kind of silence that feels thick, like it presses against your ears. As she walked down the hallway, she saw me. I was sleepwalking. That alone wouldn't have terrified her. I had never sleepwalked before, but kids do strange things sometimes. What scared her was the way I was moving. She said I wasn't just wandering aimlessly. I was moving quickly, turning sharply, as if I was chasing something she couldn't see. My eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no awareness. She called out my name. I stopped and turned toward her. When I answered, it wasn't my voice. She told me the sound that came out of my mouth was deep, low, and unmistakably male. Not like a child trying to sound scary. Not like imagination or mishearing. It was a grown man's voice, coming from a 5-year-old's body. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She didn't try to wake me up. Fear took over completely. She ran out of the apartment, barefoot, heart pounding, and didn't come back until the sun came up. She said she sat in her car the entire night, locked the doors, and prayed until morning. When she returned, I was in my bed, asleep, like nothing had happened. I don't remember any of that. Not the sleepwalking, not the voice, not chasing anything. All of it lives only in my mother's memory, burned into her mind so deeply that even now, years later, her voice changes when she talks about it. She told me there were many more incidents, too many to count, objects moving, sounds with no source, feelings of being watched. A sense that whatever was in that apartment was focused on me, watching me, interacting with me. She said that was the part that terrified her the most. Eventually we moved out. Life went on. I grew up. School, friends, work, normal experiences filled the years that followed. But every now and then, something would happen that reminded me of that time. A strange noise, a sudden chill, a dream that felt too real. And even now, as an adult, I still get that feeling sometimes. The same one my mother described. Like something unseen is just out of sight, lingering. When she finally told me everything, long after I was grown, I understood why she waited. Hearing it as a child would have broken something in me. Hearing it as an adult still shakes me to my core. I still get chills thinking about it. Not just because of the door or the stuffed animals or the voice that wasn't mine, but because there were so many moments like that. So many things that happened that we never fully understood. And the scariest part isn't what we experienced. It's the fact that whatever it was knew exactly where we lived and exactly who I was. I heard this story about 4 years ago, and even now it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of how close it felt. Close to home, close to normal life, close to something that could have gone very differently with just one small change. It's one of those stories that quietly rearranges how you think about chance, about safety, and about how thin the line really is between an ordinary evening and something unspeakable. At the time, my friend's mom was dying. She was elderly and very unwell, and carers were coming to the house every day to help look after her. It was one of those slow, drawn-out declines where everyone knows what's coming, but you still try to make the days as gentle as possible. My friend was at work most days, so a few times a week I'd go over and sit with her mom. We'd talk a little when she had the energy, or I'd just sit nearby, making sure she wasn't alone. It was quiet, sad, but also strangely intimate in the way end-of-life care often is. One afternoon while I was there, one of the carers arrived. She was friendly, professional, the kind of person who'd done this work for a long time and had that calm, steady presence about her. While she was doing her rounds, we got talking. I don't even remember how the conversation drifted to this, but at some point she started telling a story from her own life, or rather, from her family's life. She told me about her cousin. Years ago, when her cousin was a child, around 10 years old, he and a friend had been walking home one summer evening. This wasn't a city street or a busy road. It was across a local moor, the kind of open, quiet land you get in parts of northern England. Wide, empty spaces, long grass, a big sky, the sort of place where kids roam freely, especially back then when children were given much more independence and people didn't live with the same constant sense of fear. The boys were just walking, talking about whatever 10-year-old boys talk about. Nothing special, nothing memorable. Just another evening making their way home before it got too dark. Then a car pulled up beside them, not screeching to a halt, not aggressively, just slowing down and stopping alongside them, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The car window went down, and out stepped a man and a woman. The man was small, Scottish, unremarkable in appearance. The woman had blonde hair. They didn't look threatening. They didn't look strange. They didn't shout or grab or force anything. They spoke calmly, politely, like adults talking to children they assumed would trust them. They offered the boys a lift home. They said they had sweets. That detail alone is enough to make your stomach turn now, but at the time, to two children, it probably didn't sound especially alarming. Adults offered lifts. Adults gave out sweets. The world hadn't yet taught them that those things could be dangerous. But for whatever reason, instinct, luck, upbringing, or just a shared sense of unease, the boys declined. They said no. They hurried on, walking faster, glancing back occasionally as the car drove away into the distance. That was it. No chase, no shouting, no dramatic escape. Just a brief, strange encounter that probably became one of those half-forgotten childhood moments. That was odd story. Something you might mention once or twice and then never think about again. Years passed. The boys grew up. Life went on. The moment faded into the background of memory, filed away with all the other small, unexplained things that happen when you're young. Then, years later, the cousin was an adult, sitting at home watching television. A news report came on. The report was about a couple who had been arrested, a man and a woman. They were accused of kidnapping and murdering multiple children. The story was serious, heavy, the kind of thing that makes you stop what you're doing and actually watch. Then the mugshots appeared on the screen, and the man recognized them immediately. There was no hesitation, no doubt, no maybe. He knew them. He recognized the small Scottish man. He recognized the blonde woman, the same faces, the same people who had stepped out of a car on a summer evening and offered him and his friend a lift and sweets. They were Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. The realization must have been horrifying. These were not just criminals on the news. They were the same two people who had tried to get him into their car as a child. The same couple responsible for some of the most infamous crimes in British history. They had abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered several children, burying their bodies on the northern moors. Some of those children were never found. Some families never got closure. Some graves are still out there, somewhere in that vast, empty landscape. The boys had been minutes away from becoming two more names on that list. All that separated them from that fate was a polite refusal and a decision to walk on. When the carer finished telling me the story, the room felt very quiet. I remember sitting there, looking at her, feeling a cold heaviness settle in my chest. It wasn't shock in the dramatic sense. It was something slower, deeper. The kind of fear that creeps in when you realize how random survival can be. This wasn't a near miss because someone fought back or escaped a violent situation. It wasn't a story of bravery or strength. It was a story of chance, of timing, of two children deciding, for reasons they probably couldn't even explain, not to get into a car. That's what chilled me the most, because nothing about the situation would have obviously screamed danger at the time. A man and a woman together, not a lone stranger. Calm voices, an offer that sounded helpful, even kind. That's exactly how those predators operated. They didn't snatch children screaming off the street. They groomed, coaxed, manipulated. They made things seem safe. And they did it successfully, over and over again. The thought that this happened so close to where we were sitting, that the Moors mentioned in history books and documentaries were the same kind of Moors these boys had been walking across, made it all feel uncomfortably real. Not distant, not historical, not something that only existed in grainy black and white photos or old crime reports. It happened to someone you could know, someone whose life brushed up against that horror and then kept going. I kept thinking about how differently that evening could have ended. What if the boys had been tired? What if it had started raining? What if one of them had recognized the woman from somewhere and felt reassured? What if they'd just thought, it's only a lift, it'll get us home quicker? Any one of those small things could have changed everything. And then there's the unbearable thought of how many children didn't say no, how many got into that car, how many trusted, how many never made it home. What also struck me was the delay. The fact that the recognition came years later, through a television screen. Imagine living your life, growing up, building a future, only to one day realize how close you came to being erased from it entirely. How close your family came to losing you. How close you came to being one of those stories people tell in hushed voices. That kind of knowledge must sit with you forever. It also reframes memory in a terrifying way. A childhood moment that once felt insignificant suddenly becomes monumental. A fork in the road you didn't even know existed until long after you'd passed it. When people talk about the Moors murders, they often focus on the scale of the crimes, the cruelty, the number of victims, and rightly so. What Brady and Hindley did was monstrous beyond words. But stories like this add another layer of horror. The unseen near victims. The children who almost disappeared. The moments that never made it into official records because nothing happened. Except something almost did. Listening to that story in the quiet house of a dying woman made it even heavier. Life and death felt very close together in that moment. The end of one life in the room, and the story of another life that almost ended decades earlier, all overlapping in the same space. I remember leaving that house later that day and feeling different, more aware, more unsettled, looking at cars differently, thinking about how often we rely on instinct without realizing it, and how sometimes instinct is all that stands between life and death. What haunts me most is how ordinary it all was. A summer evening, two boys walking home, a car pulling up, a polite offer, no violence, no immediate threat. just the potential for unimaginable horror hiding behind a friendly face. It makes you realize that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it offers help, sometimes it looks like a couple that you wouldn't think twice about. That's why the story stayed with me. Not because it was the worst thing I'd ever heard, but because it showed how close the worst thing can come without anyone knowing. How easily someone's entire future can hinge on a single, almost forgettable decision. Every time I think about it, I'm struck by how fragile safety really is, how much of our survival comes down to coincidence, and how many people out there didn't get the chance to walk away. It chills me to the bone, not just because of who those people were, but because of how easily they could have changed the course of an ordinary life. And because somewhere, on those same moors, there are still children who never came home. This story has stayed with people for decades, not just because of how violent it was, but because of what it revealed about human behavior. It isn't only about one woman being murdered. It's about fear, hesitation, distance, and the terrifying idea that you can be surrounded by people and still be completely alone when you need help the most. In 1964, a 28-year-old woman named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death on the streets of Queens, New York. She was young, hardworking, and had just returned home from her job in the early hours of the morning. What happened to her that night is horrifying on its own. But the part that truly unsettles people is what happened around her. Or rather, what didn't happen. It was late at night in a residential neighborhood. Kitty parked her car and began walking toward her apartment building. This was not a deserted alley or some abandoned part of the city. This was a place where people lived, apartments with lights on, windows facing the street, people inside awake, going about their lives. As she walked, a man approached her. He attacked her with a knife. She screamed. Her screams were loud enough to wake people. Lights came on in nearby apartments. Curtains were pulled aside. People looked out their windows. Someone shouted something like, "Leave her alone." And for a moment, the attacker backed off. Kitty was injured but alive. She tried to get away. She staggered, wounded, toward her building, desperate for safety. This should have been the end of it. Someone yelling. Someone calling the police. Someone going outside. Someone doing anything. But instead, something chilling happened. The attacker returned. He chased her down again. He stabbed her more. She collapsed near the entrance of her building. She was bleeding heavily. She cried out for help. Her voice grew weaker as the minutes passed. And still, no one came. People later reported hearing screams. Some said they thought it was a domestic argument. Others assumed someone else had already called the police. Some didn't want to get involved. One man reportedly saw her injured and was urged by his girlfriend not to interfere. The danger felt real, but distant enough that people convinced themselves it wasn't their responsibility. This is the part that makes the story so disturbing. Dozens of people were close enough to hear or see what was happening, yet no one stepped in. No one rushed to her side. No one immediately called for help. Kitty lay there alone, dying, in a neighborhood full of people. By the time police were notified and arrived, it was too late. Kitty Genovese was dead. When the story broke, it shocked the public. Newspapers reported that as many as 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack and did nothing. The number itself became symbolic. Whether it was exactly 38 or fewer has been debated over the years, but the core truth remains the same. Multiple people were aware that something terrible was happening, and no one intervened in time. That idea is terrifying on a very deep level, Most people grow up believing that if something horrible happens in public, someone will help, that there is safety in numbers, that if you scream, if you fight, if you beg, someone will step forward. This case shattered that belief. It forced people to confront an uncomfortable question. What if no one helps? Psychologists later studied this phenomenon and called it the bystander effect. The idea is simple, but disturbing. The more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any one person is to act. Responsibility becomes diluted. Everyone assumes someone else will handle it. Fear of embarrassment, fear of being wrong, fear of personal danger, all mix together and freeze people in place. It's easy to say, I would have helped. Most of us want to believe that. But the truth is, in moments of chaos and uncertainty, people don't always become heroes. Often they become silent observers. That's what makes this story so unsettling even today. Because it isn't just about one moment in 1964. It's about human nature. It's about how fragile the idea of safety really is. It's about how social pressure, fear, and hesitation can outweigh empathy in the worst moments. Imagine being Kitty in those final minutes. You're hurt, you're scared, you're calling out for help, knowing there are people nearby. You can hear movement. You can see lights. You know you're not alone. And yet no one comes. That kind of realization, that you are visible and still ignored, is almost too painful to think about. That's the part that truly chills people. Not just that she died, but that she died knowing others were there. For many people, this story triggers a deep, lingering fear. The fear that if something terrible happens to you, others might see it and do absolutely nothing. That you could scream until your voice gives out and still be ignored. That help is not guaranteed, even in public. It makes you rethink how safe society really is, but it also forces you to reflect on yourself. Would you act? Would you call for help? Would you step in, knowing there might be danger? Or would you hesitate, waiting for someone else to move first? That discomfort is part of why this case is still talked about. On a more positive note, Kitty Genovese's death was not meaningless. Her case sparked major changes. It played a role in the development and widespread adoption of the 911 emergency system in the United States. Before this, emergency contact systems were inconsistent and confusing. People often didn't know who to call or how to reach help quickly. Her story highlighted the need for a simple, universal emergency number. It also became a foundational case in psychology and sociology. Researchers studied it to understand why people fail to act in emergencies and how to encourage intervention. Concepts like personal responsibility, diffusion of responsibility, and social influence were explored in depth because of what happened to her. In that sense, her death led to changes that have saved countless lives since. But that doesn't erase the horror of the original event. Even decades later, people still reference Kitty Genovese when talking about bystander apathy. Her name has become tied to a warning, a reminder of what can happen when everyone waits for someone else to act. What makes this story especially haunting is that it doesn't rely on extreme or rare circumstances. There was no natural disaster, no war, no chaos on a massive scale. It was a single person being attacked in a neighborhood where people were present and aware. That's what makes it feel possible anywhere. It makes you look differently at crowds, at apartment windows, at busy streets. It makes you wonder how often people hear something and decide it's not their problem. How often someone is in danger while others convince themselves it's nothing. It also highlights how fear works. Not just fear of violence, but fear of involvement, fear of being wrong, fear of consequences. fear of stepping outside your role. Sometimes people don't act because they're cruel. More often, they don't act because they're scared. That doesn't make the outcome any less tragic. Kitty Genovese was a real person. She had a life, relationships, plans, and dreams. She wasn't a case study when she was alive. She became one only after she died. That fact alone is heartbreaking. Her story forces us to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Society depends on individuals choosing to care, choosing to act, choosing to break through fear and hesitation. When that doesn't happen, the consequences can be fatal. This case continues to scare people because it strips away the illusion that someone will always come to save you. It shows that safety isn't just about laws or police or systems. It's about human decisions made in moments of stress, and those decisions are unpredictable. The hope is that by remembering stories like this, people become more aware, more willing to act, more willing to make the call, shout louder, step outside, or take responsibility instead of waiting. That's the legacy Kitty Genovese left behind. A warning, yes, but also a chance to do better, because the most terrifying part of her story isn't the knife. It's the silence that followed her screams. This is one of those cases that never really leaves your mind once you learn about it. It isn't just frightening because of the violence, or even because of how calculated it was. It's terrifying because it takes something most people associate with safety, peace, and family togetherness, and turns it into a nightmare. Camping, a provincial park, a family trip meant to create memories. All of it destroyed by one person who decided to act on his worst impulses. For me, it's the Wells Gray murders that still haunt me. It happened in August of 1982, near Wells Gray Provincial Park in Canada. A family had traveled there to camp, the kind of trip countless families take every year without a second thought. They were the Johnson family, Bob and Jackie Johnson, their daughters Janet, who was 13, and Karen, who was 11. With them were the girls' grandparents, George and Edith Bentley. 3 generations together, sharing time, nature, and what should have been a peaceful summer holiday. Instead, they crossed paths with David Shearing. Shearing didn't attack them impulsively. That's part of what makes this case so disturbing. He stalked the family at their campsite. He watched them. He learned their routines. He waited. There was intent and patience behind what he did, which somehow makes it even more horrifying. This wasn't a moment of sudden rage. It was deliberate. At some point, Shearing struck. He murdered all 4 adults, Bob and Jackie Johnson, and George and Edith Bentley. These were parents and grandparents who had brought their children and grandchildren out into the wilderness, trusting that a campground was a safe place to be. They never stood a chance. What happened next is almost unbearable to think about. After killing the adults, Shearing abducted Janet and Karen, 2 young girls suddenly alone, their entire family gone in an instant. He kept them alive for about a week. During that time, Janet was repeatedly sexually assaulted. It's difficult to even write that sentence, and impossible to fully comprehend the fear and suffering she must have endured. Karen, younger and watching everything unfold, would have been living in constant terror, not knowing when it would end or what would happen next. Eventually, Shearing killed Karen. Janet was killed the following day. The brutality didn't stop there. In an attempt to cover up his crimes, Shearing placed the bodies of the entire family into their vehicle and set it on fire. When the remains were discovered, the adults were found in the burned-out car, and the 2 girls had been stuffed into the trunk. That detail alone is enough to make most people feel physically sick. It shows not only cruelty, but a complete lack of humanity. This wasn't just murder, it was annihilation. An entire family was wiped out. Parents, grandparents, children, no survivors. No one left behind to tell their story firsthand. When you sit with this case, what becomes overwhelming is how vulnerable they were. They were doing something normal, something wholesome, something that millions of families do every year. They weren't taking risks. They weren't involved in anything dangerous. They were just camping. And yet one man was enough to destroy everything. What makes this story especially chilling for me now is that I have a daughter. When I first learned about this case, it horrified me. After becoming a parent, it hit on a completely different level. The idea of a child suffering that kind of fear, pain, and isolation is the worst thing I can imagine. Worse than death itself is the prolonged terror, the not knowing, the waiting. It forces you to imagine the unimaginable. What must Janet have felt, knowing her parents and grandparents were gone? What must Karen have felt, watching her older sister suffer and knowing she could be next? How long must each hour have felt to them? How does a child even process something like that? Those questions don't have answers, and maybe they shouldn't. But they linger anyway. The case was eventually solved and Shearing was caught. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But no sentence could ever balance what was taken. The Johnson and Bentley families lost everything. The girls were robbed not just of their lives, but of any sense of safety or dignity in their final days. Years later, the case was revisited in a television documentary series called The Detectives. The episode covering the Wells Gray murders is told largely from the perspective of the detective who worked the case and helped bring it to a close. It's well done, thorough, and deeply unsettling. Hearing the details laid out calmly by someone who had to live with them professionally adds another layer of weight. It's not sensationalized, but that almost makes it worse. The facts alone are enough. Watching it, you can feel the lingering impact the case had on the people who investigated it. Even decades later, it's clear that this wasn't just another file. It stayed with them, just as it stays with anyone who learns the story. What truly scares me about the Wells Gray murders is not just the cruelty of one man, but the randomness of it. The family wasn't targeted because of who they were. They weren't involved in anything risky. They were simply there, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong person watching them. That randomness is terrifying. It means that safety is never absolute. It means that even in places we associate with peace and escape, danger can exist quietly, waiting. It forces you to confront the fact that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it blends into the background, watching, waiting. It also highlights something deeply uncomfortable about how predators operate. Shearing didn't just kill and flee. He took time. He exerted control. He inflicted prolonged suffering. That level of cruelty speaks to a kind of darkness that is hard to accept as part of humanity, yet undeniably is. For parents, this case hits especially hard. We spend so much of our lives trying to protect our children, to keep them safe, to give them happy memories. The idea that someone could take advantage of their trust and vulnerability in such a devastating way is almost too much to bear. It's the kind of fear that sits in your chest long after you stop thinking about the story directly. And yet stories like this matter. Not because they entertain, but because they remind us of the importance of vigilance, of looking out for one another, of not assuming that danger always looks obvious. They remind us that victims are real people, families, children with names and lives and futures that mattered. The Wells Gray murders are not just a true crime story. They are a tragedy that represents the absolute worst of what one human being can do to others. They are a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how devastating the consequences are when it's shattered. I think about Janet and Karen often, even though I never knew them. I think about their parents and grandparents and how that trip should have been remembered with photos and stories instead of headlines and police reports. I think about how many moments of joy were stolen, not just from them, but from everyone who loved them. And as a parent, I think about my own child and how unbearable the thought is of her ever experiencing even a fraction of that fear. That's why this case stays with me. Not because it's the most shocking story I've ever heard, but because it represents the worst thing I can imagine happening to a family. And because it happened in a place that was supposed to be safe. That combination makes it unforgettable. This is one of those experiences that sounds unreal until you really sit with it. And then it becomes genuinely terrifying because you realize how easily it could happen to almost anyone. Not because they're sick, dangerous, or unstable, but because the system itself can be manipulated when the wrong person knows the right words. This all happened over the span of my 20s. A decade that should have been about building a life, learning who I was, gaining independence, and slowly finding my footing in the world. Instead, large parts of it were spent locked inside treatment centers for conditions I did not have, trying to prove my sanity to people who had already decided I was sick. The root of it all was my dad's girlfriend. She had borderline personality disorder, though at the time, that label didn't mean much to me. What I did know was that she didn't like me. Not in a casual, distant way, but in a deep, personal, hostile way. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, she decided that I was a problem that needed to be removed. The most dangerous thing about her wasn't just her dislike of me. It was that she knew psychological language. She knew the terms. She knew how diagnoses were framed. She knew how to talk to doctors, social workers, and clinicians in a way that made her sound credible, concerned, and reasonable. She knew exactly what to say. In the mental health system, there's an assumption that people who are sick don't know they're sick. That denial is a symptom. That resistance is part of the illness. And once someone with authority decides that applies to you, every attempt you make to defend yourself can be twisted into evidence against you. That's how I ended up committed, not once, several times. Over the years, I was locked into multiple treatment centers for conditions that were never actually mine. The most notable were an eating disorder treatment center and the county psych ward. Each place was its own version of hell, but they all shared one thing in common. I was trapped, and no one believed me. The eating disorder center was especially dehumanizing. In that place, control was absolute. They controlled when you ate, what you ate, how fast you ate, where you sat, when you could move, when you could sleep. And yes, they had to watch you while you went to the bathroom. Literally monitor you while you pooped to make sure you weren't purging or engaging in behaviors they had already decided you must be doing. There is something deeply violating about being watched during the most private bodily functions, especially when you know you don't belong there. It strips you of dignity in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. You stop feeling like a person and start feeling like an object being managed. I kept trying to explain that I didn't have an eating disorder, that I ate normally, that my weight was stable, that there was no history of disordered eating. But here's the terrifying part. Many mental illnesses, especially eating disorders, list anosognosia as a symptom. Anosognosia means the person is unaware of or denies their illness. So the more you deny the accusations, the more firmly your diagnosis is cemented. If you say you don't have a problem, that's proof you don't understand your problem. If you argue, you're being resistant. If you cry, you're emotionally unstable. If you stay calm, you're manipulative. There is no correct response. Once you're labeled, everything you do is filtered through that label. Your words stop being words and start being symptoms. Your reactions stop being human and start being clinical data. That's when it really starts to feel like a horror movie, because you realize you're trapped in a system where logic doesn't apply to you anymore, where truth is irrelevant, where the person accusing you has more credibility than you ever will, simply because they aren't the one being evaluated. The county psych ward was even worse. Psych wards are supposed to be places of safety, stabilization, and care. In reality, many of them are overcrowded, underfunded, and chaotic. They house people in genuine crisis alongside people who are violent, unpredictable, or severely unwell, all under the same roof. In that ward, I was threatened by another patient. He threatened me with rape using scissors. That sentence still feels unreal to type, even now. There was no dramatic intervention, no immediate protection, just fear, constant, gnawing fear. The kind that keeps you awake at night, listening for footsteps, watching every movement around you, calculating where you could run if something happened. And the worst part is that when you're already labeled as mentally ill, your fear isn't always taken seriously. Complaints can be dismissed as paranoia. Concerns can be reframed as delusions. You learn very quickly that speaking up can make things worse, not better. So you learn to stay quiet, you learn to disappear, you learn to survive. What made all of this especially horrifying was the knowledge that I was there because someone wanted me there. Not because I was a danger to myself or others. Not because I was sick, but because one person didn't like me and knew how to weaponize the system. That realization fundamentally changed how I see mental health care. I believe mental health treatment can save lives. I believe people need help, support, and compassion. But I also know now how easily that same system can be used as a tool of control, punishment, and abuse when safeguards fail. And safeguards fail more often than people want to admit. There's this comforting belief that only obviously unstable people get committed, that doctors always know the truth, that the system can't be tricked, that someone wouldn't end up locked away unless they really needed to be there. That belief is false. All it takes is the right person, with the right vocabulary, speaking to the right authority at the right time. If you already have family conflict, power imbalances, or strained relationships, you are especially vulnerable. If you're young, dependent, or already seen as difficult, it becomes even easier. What still chills me is how helpless I felt. I wasn't free to leave. I wasn't free to refuse treatment. I wasn't free to say no. My body was present, but my autonomy was gone. People talked about me while I was in the room. Decisions were made without my consent. My reality was questioned constantly. You start to doubt yourself even when you know you're telling the truth. That's another quiet cruelty of these environments. Our gaslighting doesn't need to be intentional when the structure itself encourages it. Eventually I got out. Not because someone suddenly realized the truth, but because time passed. Evaluations shifted, and circumstances changed. I aged out of some of the control, The person pushing for my commitment lost influence. The system moved on to the next crisis. But the damage didn't disappear. Being falsely committed does something to your brain. It changes how safe you feel in the world. It makes you hyper-aware of how fragile freedom really is. It teaches you that institutions you're told to trust can become prisons overnight. Even now, I carry a deep, instinctive fear of being misunderstood by authority figures. Doctors, therapists, social workers. Anyone who has the power to define me without my consent. I'm careful about what I say. I'm careful about how I phrase things. Careful about showing emotion. Because once you've been trapped like that, you never forget how fast words can be turned against you. What makes this even more disturbing is how common this kind of story actually is. Once you start talking about it, you hear similar experiences from other people. People who were committed because they were inconvenient, because they were outspoken, because they didn't fit into someone else's narrative. It's scary to think how many people are inside these systems right now trying to explain that they don't belong there and being told that their denial proves the diagnosis. That's why I say this, and I mean it deeply. If you have a bad feeling about someone, don't give them the benefit of the doubt. We're taught to be polite, to be forgiving, to assume good intentions. But there are people who know how to exploit systems, and they rely on others being too kind, too hesitant, too unsure to question them. This isn't about paranoia. It's about self-protection. Because once you're inside that world, getting out can be incredibly difficult. And the longer you're there, the harder it becomes to convince anyone that you were never meant to be there at all. For the record, and because it matters, I'm 5'5" and weigh 100 to 25 pounds. I include that not for validation, but to underline the absurdity of the accusations. My body never reflected an eating disorder. My life never reflected one. But facts don't always matter when narratives take over. That's the real horror. Not locked doors or threats or restraints, though those are terrifying enough. The real horror is realizing that your reality can be overwritten by someone else's story, and that once that happens, your voice becomes just another symptom to be managed. It's like living inside a horror movie, where the monster isn't a creature or a killer, but a system that refuses to hear you. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. This story is one of those moments in history that feels unreal the more you think about it. It doesn't feel like a normal battle, and it doesn't fit the way wars are usually described, with maps, movements, and victories. Instead, it feels like something pulled straight out of a nightmare. Something that should not have happened, but did. And once you imagine it clearly, it becomes very hard to forget. It happened during the First World War, in 1915. At that time, Europe was tearing itself apart. Millions of men were living in trenches filled with mud, rats, disease, and fear. Death was constant. Artillery shells fell day and night. Bodies were buried and uncovered again by explosions. Soldiers lived knowing that any moment could be their last. But even with all of that horror, what happened at a place called Osowiec Fortress stood out as something different. Osowiec Fortress was held by Russian troops. It sat in a miserable location, surrounded by marshland and swamps. The area was damp, cold, and unhealthy. Life inside the fortress was hard even without enemy attacks. But its location made it important It blocked German movement and protected key routes, which made it a target worth destroying. The Germans had been trying to take Osowiec for a long time. They bombarded it with heavy artillery. They attacked repeatedly. But the Russian defenders held on. They were poorly supplied, exhausted, and living in terrible conditions. But they refused to abandon the fortress. By the summer of 1915, the German command had grown frustrated. Conventional attacks were not working fast enough. They wanted the fortress cleared, and they wanted it done decisively. So they turned to a new kind of weapon, something far more horrifying than shells and bullets. They decided to use poison gas. At that point in the war, chemical weapons were still relatively new. There were no reliable gas masks like those developed later. Most soldiers had no real protection at all. If gas was released, survival depended on luck, wind direction, and desperate improvisation. On August 6, 1915, the Germans launched their gas attack on Osowiec. They released a massive cloud of chlorine mixed with bromine. This gas did not explode or burn. It crept. It rolled slowly across the ground, thick and heavy, moving like a living thing. A greenish-yellow fog advanced toward the fortress, carried by the wind. The Russian soldiers saw it coming. Some of them had heard rumors of gas attacks elsewhere. Some may have understood that this was something different from smoke. But they had no proper equipment to protect themselves. No sealed masks, no filters. Some soldiers tried to cover their faces with cloth, shirts, or rags soaked in water. Others had nothing at all. As the gas reached them, it began to do its work. The effect on the land itself was immediate and horrifying. Grass turned black as if burned. Leaves shriveled and died. Plants collapsed. The air took on a sharp, metallic smell that burned the nose and throat. Even metal objects began to react. Copper fittings on artillery pieces oxidized, changing color from the chemical exposure. It was as if the earth itself was being poisoned. For the men who breathed it in, the suffering was beyond anything they had experienced before. Chlorine gas attacks the lungs. When inhaled, it reacts with moisture inside the airways and forms acid. This acid burns the throat, the eyes, and the lungs from the inside. Breathing becomes agony. The chest feels like it is on fire. The lungs fill with fluid. Victims cough violently, desperately trying to clear their airways, but each breath only makes things worse. People did not simply suffocate. They drowned. They drowned in their own fluids and blood, as their lungs were chemically destroyed. Some men collapsed immediately. Others staggered, choking and coughing, unable to see properly as their eyes burned and swelled. Screams turned into hoarse gasps. Voices failed. Within minutes, the gas attack had done what the Germans expected it to do. Most of the Russian defenders were incapacitated or dying. From the German perspective, the fortress was finished. No human being could survive exposure like that. They believed the gas had killed everyone still inside. The fortress, they assumed, was now nothing more than a poisoned ruin filled with corpses. So once the gas cloud thinned enough, German infantry units were ordered to advance. They moved forward cautiously at first, expecting silence. They expected to find bodies slumped in trenches, dead men lying where they had fallen. They expected no resistance. What they encountered instead was something that shattered their understanding of reality. Out of the lingering gas came Russian soldiers. Not many of them, just the survivors. But the way they looked was enough to break hardened men. These soldiers no longer looked fully human. Their uniforms were torn, soaked, and stained dark. Their faces were swollen, burned, and discolored by the gas. Their eyes were red, damaged, and barely able to see. Their skin was blistered in places. Blood covered their mouths and chests as they coughed uncontrollably. Some were coughing so violently that pieces of their lungs were coming up with the blood. They struggled to breathe. They staggered as they moved. Some held their throats or clutched their chests. Others leaned on their rifles just to stay upright. Every step looked painful. Every breath looked like torture. And yet, they were advancing. They raised their rifles. They fixed bayonets. They moved forward through the gas and smoke toward the German lines. They did not shout. They did not cheer. There were no victory cries. There was only coughing, choking, and the sound of boots dragging through the mud. To the German soldiers watching this, it was like seeing the dead rise. Men they were certain had been killed by poison gas were now coming toward them, visibly dying, bleeding, and broken, yet still fighting. Faces twisted in agony, bodies already half destroyed, refusing to fall. It looked unnatural. It looked impossible, and it terrified them. Panic spread through the German ranks almost instantly. These were not inexperienced troops. They were soldiers who had endured artillery bombardments, trench assaults, and mass death. But nothing had prepared them for this. Some German soldiers froze. Others dropped their weapons and ran. Discipline collapsed. Fear took over. The sight of poisoned men advancing, like coughing blood, skin burned, eyes ruined, still charging forward, was more than their minds could handle. The German attack broke apart. They retreated. This moment became known as the attack of the dead men. Not because the Russians won a decisive victory, not because they turned the tide of the war, but because of what it represented. Men who were already dying, men whose lungs had been destroyed, men who knew they had no future, still rose and attacked. Every Russian soldier who took part in that counterattack was doomed. There was no recovery from chlorine gas exposure at that level. Medical care at the time was limited even for normal wounds. Chemical damage like this was irreversible. These men knew it. They could feel it in their burning lungs. They could taste blood with every breath. They knew they were dying. And they attacked anyway. That is what makes this story so haunting. It wasn't bravery in a clean, heroic sense. It wasn't about medals or glory. It was about desperation, about rage, about refusal. Refusal to surrender. Refusal to lie down and wait for death while the enemy walked in unopposed. Their bodies were failing, but their will had not yet broken. In the end, the Russians did not hold Osowiec forever. Later, for strategic reasons, they abandoned the fortress. The war continued. Millions more died. The world changed. But that single moment stayed, because it showed how far war had fallen. It showed what chemical warfare does to people, how it strips away dignity, humanity, and meaning, how it turns soldiers into walking casualties, still alive but already condemned. Chemical weapons do not kill quickly. They do not allow clean deaths. They destroy the body slowly, painfully, and visibly. They leave men coughing blood, choking, blinded, and burned. The attack of the dead men wasn't just a military event. It was a warning, a glimpse into a future where war would no longer be about combat alone, but about suffering on an industrial scale. The Germans did not retreat because they were outmaneuvered. They retreated because they were confronted with something that broke the human mind, the realization that even death would not stop the men they were fighting. And the Russians paid for that moment with their lives. Every soldier who rose and charged that day would later die from the gas. Some may have lasted hours, some days. But none escaped the damage done to their lungs and bodies. There was no victory waiting for them, no survival. Oh, only the knowledge that they would not let the enemy take the fortress without facing them. That is what makes this story so disturbing. It is not about numbers. It is not about tactics. It is not about success or failure. It is about what happens when war pushes human beings past the point where survival is possible, yet still demands action from them. Men reduced to something that looked monstrous to the enemy. Land poisoned beyond recognition. Bodies ruined beyond repair. Victory rendered meaningless. The attack of the dead men is remembered not because it changed the war, but because it revealed the true cost of it. It showed that modern warfare could turn people into symbols of horror rather than individuals. It showed how easily humanity could be stripped away by weapons that attacked not just the body, but the very idea of what it means to be alive. When people think of war, they often think of bravery, sacrifice, and honor. This story forces a different perspective. It shows suffering without purpose, courage without reward, death without meaning. Men who knew they were already dead still stood up, picked up their weapons, and walked into gunfire while coughing up their own blood. That image lingers, not because it inspires, but because it terrifies. It is a reminder of how inhuman war can become when technology outpaces morality, and how deeply unsettling it is to face an enemy who refuses to stay down. Not because they are invincible, but because they have nothing left to lose. The attack of the dead men does not ask to be celebrated. It asks to be remembered as a warning. From the outside, our neighborhood looked normal. Quiet streets, familiar faces. The kind of place where you recognize people by their routines more than by their names. Nothing about it suggested danger in any obvious way. But there was one house that everyone knew about, even if no one talked about it openly. Our neighbor was infamous for fighting. Not the occasional argument, not raised voices once in a while, but full-blown screaming matches that seemed to happen almost every night. You could hear them through closed windows. You could hear them from down the street. It became part of the background noise of living there, like traffic or barking dogs. People would shake their heads, roll their eyes, maybe complain quietly. But no one ever did much more than that. It was always the same pattern. Yelling, accusations, insults. Doors slamming, sometimes things being thrown, sometimes long stretches of silence afterward, followed by another explosion. Everyone knew the husband drank too much. That was common knowledge. When the shouting started, most of us just assumed he was drunk again and they were having another one of their fights. That's what made that night feel so ordinary at first. I was outside, minding my own business, doing nothing important. I remember hearing the familiar sound of their voices rising, sharp and angry, carrying through the air. I rolled my eyes almost automatically. In my head, I thought, here we go again. Another night, another fight about him being drunk. For the first few minutes, it sounded exactly like every other argument they had. Loud, heated, but nothing that stood out as unusual compared to what we'd already grown used to hearing. I didn't pay much attention. I'd heard this so many times before that it barely registered as something worth worrying about. Then a few minutes passed, and the noise changed. I started hearing things being thrown inside their house, not just one crash, but several. Heavy sounds, objects hitting walls or floors hard enough that you could tell this wasn't just someone knocking something over by accident. That made me pause. Still, I told myself it was probably just another escalation. They fought like this all the time. Then I heard the wife's voice clearly, sharp with anger and disbelief. "You did what?" she yelled. That sentence cut through everything else. I remember thinking that the husband must have done something really bad this time. Something that crossed the line even by their usual standards. But still, my mind stayed in familiar territory. Cheating, drinking too much, breaking something expensive, saying something unforgivable. All the things people argue about when their relationship is already toxic. After that, the voices became harder to make out. The shouting continued, but it was more muffled, less clear. I couldn't piece together exactly what was being said anymore. I didn't have the full picture of what was happening inside that house. Then the tone changed completely. The wife started screaming. Not angry screaming, not yelling insults. This was different. This was fear. Her voice cracked as she screamed, "Get away from me, and let me go!" That's when my stomach dropped. Those words didn't sound like part of a normal fight. They didn't sound like two people yelling at each other. They sounded like someone trying to escape something. Like someone who was in real danger. The screams kept going, and I started to feel that creeping sense of panic. I remember standing there, frozen for a moment, trying to decide what to do. My brain was racing. Should I call the cops? Was I overreacting? What if it was just another argument that sounded worse than it actually was? That hesitation is something that still bothers me. I was right on the edge of calling the police when I saw a police car pull up in front of their house. Someone else had already made the call. At the time, I assumed it was probably just a noise complaint. Another neighbor who'd finally had enough of the yelling. When the police arrived, the fighting stopped almost immediately. The screaming cut off. The noise died down. The house went quiet in a way that felt unnatural after all that chaos. I remember thinking, okay, it's over. They'll calm things down, maybe take someone aside, maybe issue a warning, and that'll be it. Just another incident in a long line of incidents. The police didn't stay very long. After they left, the neighborhood went back to its usual rhythm. No sirens. No more shouting that night. I told myself that whatever had happened had been handled. That maybe the presence of the police had scared him into stopping. I didn't think much more about it. A few days passed. Life went on. School, routines, normal distractions. That night faded into the background of my memory. Just another disturbing argument in that house full of disturbing arguments. Then, one afternoon, I came back from school and immediately noticed something was wrong. There were 3 police cars parked in front of the neighbor's house. Not 1. 3. That alone was enough to make my heart start racing. Police cars didn't show up like that for noise complaints or routine domestic calls. Something serious was happening. I saw officers moving around, talking to each other, focused and tense. Then I saw the husband. He was in handcuffs. They were arresting him. At first, my mind jumped to the most obvious explanation. Domestic violence. Maybe the wife had finally reported him. Maybe what happened that night had crossed a legal line, and this was the result. Even that thought was unsettling, but it still felt like something I could process. As I walked into our house, my parents were standing by the window, watching everything unfold. Their faces were serious in a way that immediately told me this was worse than I thought. I asked them what was going on. My mom turned to me and told me what she had heard from another neighbor. The man had murdered his wife. Not just killed her. Murdered her and chopped her up. I remember feeling like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. My brain refused to accept the words at first. It sounded too extreme, too horrific to be real. This wasn't a movie. This was the house next door. The same place where we'd heard arguments for years. The same people whose fights we'd dismissed as just loud and toxic. I stood there in shock, trying to process it. Then the local news came on the TV, and it was real. The report confirmed everything. The man had killed his wife. Afterward, he had dismembered her body and hidden the parts in their washer room. To try to conceal the smell, he had covered the body parts with powdered laundry soap. That detail is the one that still makes my skin crawl. The idea that, after committing something so horrific, he went about trying to clean it up in such a mundane, domestic way, using laundry soap, in the same house where they'd lived, the same house where we'd heard her screaming. Suddenly, the night of the argument replayed itself in my head with terrifying clarity. You did what? Get away from me. Let me go. Those weren't just the sounds of another fight. They were the sounds of someone realizing, too late, that they were in mortal danger. The police car that had shown up that night hadn't stopped a fight. It had arrived in the middle of something far worse. And somehow, impossibly, it had ended without anyone realizing what had already happened or what was about to happen. The thought that I had been standing outside, listening, debating whether to call the police, made me feel sick. Not because I believe I could have saved her, but because of how close it all was, how thin the line was between just another argument and something unspeakable. It was horrifying to realize that I had been living next to a psychopath. Not someone who looked obviously dangerous. Not someone who stood out as a monster. Just a man who yelled a lot, drank too much, and fought with his wife. The kind of person people learn to ignore. The kind of situation people mentally file under not my business. That realization messed with my head. For a long time afterward, I kept imagining different scenarios. What if he hadn't stopped with her? What if he'd gone on a rampage? What if he'd come outside after that fight, still drunk, still enraged? Our house was right there. So were other families, kids, neighbors. The distance between my life and a real-life horror movie suddenly felt terrifyingly small. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. How close our houses were. How thin the walls probably were. How easy it would be for violence to spill over from one space into another. The sense of safety I'd taken for granted cracked, and I couldn't unsee it. Even now, years later, the story still creeps me out. Yes, it's the kind of thing that gets told in groups of friends. People react with shock, disbelief. That nervous laughter people use when they don't know how else to respond. It sounds dramatic. It sounds unreal. It sounds like something that only happens far away, to other people. But it happened right next to me. That's what makes it stick. It taught me how dangerous it is to normalize warning signs. How easy it is to dismiss constant violence as just how they are. How quickly screaming becomes background noise when you hear it often enough. It also taught me how sudden and brutal reality can be. How a life can end behind closed doors while the rest of the world goes on, assuming it's just another argument. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that house. About the silence after the police left that first night. About how wrong that silence actually was. About the things no one could see, hidden just beyond the walls. It's unsettling to know how close I came to witnessing something even worse. How close all of us were. That's why it still feels like the closest I've ever come to a real-life horror movie. Not because of jump scares or monsters, but because of how ordinary it all seemed, right up until it wasn't. This is one of those stories that crawls under your skin the longer you sit with it. Not because it's fast or dramatic, but because of how quietly it existed for years, hidden in plain sight. It's frightening in a very specific way. The kind of fear that makes you look differently at the people around you, at ordinary buildings, at strangers who don't stand out for any obvious reason. It's the fear of realizing how easily something horrific can live right next to normal life without being noticed. Fritz Hanke was a German serial killer who lived in Hamburg. His name doesn't always come up as often as some other killers, but what he did is among the most disturbing cases in modern European crime history. Part of what makes his story so unsettling is not just the violence, but how ordinary and invisible he was to the outside world. Hanke had a deeply messed up childhood. There were accidents, neglect, and trauma early in his life, and those things left permanent marks on both his body and his mind. Physically, he was described as one of the ugliest people you could imagine. That's not exaggeration or cruelty. It's how witnesses and investigators consistently described him. He had severely damaged, rotting teeth. One of his eyes wandered uncontrollably. His back was twisted and deformed. His hands were large, misshapen, and grotesque. His body looked broken, like something had gone wrong in its development and never recovered. Because of this, he was at the very bottom of the social ladder. He wasn't charming. He wasn't attractive. He wasn't respected. He wasn't someone people wanted to be around. He lived on the margins of society, surviving mostly through heavy drinking and drifting through low-level jobs or welfare. Alcohol was a constant presence in his life. He drank heavily, daily, often to the point of barely functioning. But what's important to understand is that being socially low status and physically repulsive doesn't automatically make someone violent. Many people live hard, ugly, lonely lives without hurting anyone. What makes Hanke terrifying is how those factors combined with something deeply broken inside him. His victims were mostly women who were already vulnerable. Low-class women, ex-prostitutes, women struggling with addiction, poverty, or homelessness. These were people society largely ignored. People who disappeared without raising immediate alarms. People whose absence could be explained away as moving on, relapsing, or falling out of contact. Hanke knew exactly who to target. He didn't go after women with families who would search endlessly. He preyed on women no one expected to be safe in the first place. He would meet them in bars, especially places known for heavy drinking and desperation. He came across as sad, lonely, sometimes even gentle. He wasn't smooth or charismatic, but he could appear harmless, pitiful even. Someone you might feel sorry for rather than fear. That's part of what makes this case so disturbing. Other than his appearance, he could seem almost normal, sometimes even sensitive. People who interacted with him didn't describe him as overtly aggressive or threatening in public. He wasn't constantly violent or explosive. He blended into the background of seedy bars and run-down neighborhoods. Once he brought a woman back to his apartment, everything changed. He raped them. He strangled them to death. And then he did something that still horrifies people decades later. He dismembered their bodies. He cut them into pieces and stored them inside his apartment, hiding body parts behind a wall, literally within the walls of his living space. He continued living there, drinking, sleeping, eating, while the remains of multiple murdered women were concealed just feet away. The smell was unbearable. Neighbors complained constantly about the stench coming from his apartment. A sickening, rotting smell that never fully went away. Hanke had excuses. He blamed it on garbage, on spoiled food, on plumbing issues, on his own poor hygiene. Because he himself smelled bad. Because he was known as an alcoholic who lived in filth, people accepted those explanations more easily than they should have. This is one of the most chilling parts of the story. The signs were there. The smell, the isolation, the drinking, the strange behavior. But because he lived in a poor area, because he was already seen as disgusting and undesirable, people didn't push further. His life was already considered a mess, so nothing about it stood out as alarming enough to trigger real investigation. His crimes continued. The bodies stayed hidden, and no one would have ever found them if it weren't for a fire. That fire is the moment where everything unraveled. One day, a fire broke out in Hanka's apartment. Emergency services responded. Firefighters entered the building, dealing with smoke and damage. As they moved through the apartment, they discovered something far worse than fire damage. Human remains, pieces of bodies hidden behind walls. The truth finally came out, not because of police work or witness testimony, but because of pure chance. An accident. Bad luck. Or maybe the only thing that could have stopped him. When the full extent of his crimes was revealed, the horror shocked Germany. It wasn't just the murders. It was the fact that they had been happening in a normal apartment building in a major city for years. People had lived above him, beside him, past him on the stairs, shared walls with him, all while bodies were decomposing behind plaster and brick. The idea that someone like that could exist so close to normal life is deeply unsettling. What makes Fritz Hanka especially frightening is that he wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't intelligent in any impressive way. He wasn't careful or sophisticated. He was sloppy, drunk, and disorganized, and yet he got away with it. Not because he was clever, but because his victims didn't matter to society. That's the part that sticks with you. If his victims had been wealthy, connected, or respected, the investigation would have come sooner. The smell would have been taken seriously. The complaints would have been escalated. But because they were poor, addicted, or marginalized, their disappearance didn't trigger immediate alarm. Hanka himself was dismissed as a pathetic drunk. People didn't see him as dangerous. They saw him as disgusting, sad, and broken. And that allowed him to continue. Another unsettling aspect of his personality was how contradictory he could be. Some accounts describe moments where he appeared almost loving or emotionally sensitive. He wasn't constantly raging. He wasn't a cartoon monster. He had moods, soft moments, human reactions. That's not meant to make him sympathetic. It's meant to make the reality more disturbing. Because it means monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like damaged people, broken by life, drifting through society's cracks. Sometimes they laugh. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they seem almost gentle. And then they kill. There's something especially horrifying about the idea that if the fire had never happened, Hanka might never have been caught. He could have died quietly. His apartment could have been renovated, the walls sealed, the bodies lost forever. That thought alone is enough to make your skin crawl. It forces you to confront the idea that there may be people like him who are never discovered. Not because they're smarter, but because the world around them doesn't care enough to look closely. That's why this story hits so hard. It's not just about one killer. It's about neglect, about how society decides who matters and who doesn't, about how easy it is for violence to hide where no one wants to look. It also taps into a very personal fear, the idea that someone like that could be near you, in your building, on your street, in your bar, someone who doesn't stand out as powerful or threatening, but who carries something dark and lethal inside them. The thought that evil doesn't always announce itself is terrifying. Hanka didn't lure victims with charm or money. He didn't kidnap strangers off the street. He didn't fit the stereotype people expect. He existed quietly, invisibly, blending into the lowest levels of society where suffering is common and ignored. And that's what makes him such a haunting figure. There's a well-known book and a movie about his life and crimes, and while they're well made, they're hard to watch or read without feeling deeply unsettled. Not because of graphic shock alone, but because they force you to imagine living next to him, smelling the rot, hearing the noises, seeing him on the stairs, knowing now what was really happening behind those walls. It makes you question how well you really know the world around you. How many things we ignore because they're uncomfortable. How many warning signs we explain away. How many people disappear without anyone noticing. Fritz Honka wasn't some genius criminal hiding in plain sight through brilliance. He was hiding because no one cared enough to look. That's the true horror. It's scary to think that someone like that could exist in your proximity, in your daily life, and you would never know. Not because you're naive, but because the system itself doesn't protect everyone equally. This story doesn't just leave you afraid of serial killers. It leaves you afraid of indifference, of silence, of neglect, of the spaces where suffering is expected and therefore ignored. And once you understand that, it's very hard to shake the feeling that somewhere, right now, something terrible could be happening, hidden behind walls, waiting for an accident to bring it into the light. That's why Fritz Honka's story stays with people. Not because of how loud it was, but because of how quiet it remained for so long. What I'm about to describe isn't a single shocking moment. It isn't one isolated incident that stands out because it was louder or bloodier than the rest. It's disturbing because of how normal it became, how often it happened, and how little control anyone seemed to have over it. When you live in a place like Baghdad during that time, violence stops being something rare and becomes part of the background of daily life. That doesn't mean it ever feels okay. It just means your mind is forced to adapt in ways that still don't sit right with me. I saw more gangland-style executions in Baghdad than I could ever have imagined before I went there. Not in movies, not in documentaries, not in history books. Real people, real streets, real bodies. Executions carried out casually, efficiently, and without hesitation, often in broad daylight, often in places where children lived and played. Al-Qaeda and similar groups weren't just fighting us or targeting military objectives. They were playing what they called morality police. That phrase alone still makes my stomach turn. They decided they had the right to judge who deserved to live or die based on their version of morality, and they enforced it with bullets. Young girls were a common target. Girls who didn't dress modestly enough by their standards. Girls who were seen talking to men they weren't married to. Girls who were accused, sometimes falsely, of dishonoring their families. There was no trial, no warning, no chance to explain or escape. Someone would point a finger, and that was enough. You'd hear about it first, usually secondhand. Then you'd see it, a body in the street. A crowd gathered, but standing back, afraid to get too close. Fear hanging in the air thicker than the dust. Cat houses were targeted too. Entire buildings shot up, everyone inside killed. Not because they were a threat, not because they were armed, but because someone decided they were immoral. Men would walk in with guns and leave nothing alive behind them. By the time we responded, there was nothing to do but document and clear the aftermath. Working with or around coalition forces was another death sentence. If they learned that someone was working at our bases, even in a minor role, they didn't just kill that person. They went after whole families, parents, siblings, sometimes children. Guilt by association was enough. Fear was the point. The message was clear. Help them, and everyone you love dies. Cars were watched constantly. If they identified a vehicle that came and went from our base, that car became a target. They would ambush it when it was most vulnerable. On a side street, at a checkpoint, on the way home. I've responded to scenes that still don't feel real when I think about them now. Cars riddled with bullets, windshields shattered, doors blown open, blood everywhere. People inside shot so badly that they tried to escape while dying, only to fall out and get dragged by the moving vehicle. Bodies scraped along the road for hundreds of feet. There's no clean way to describe what that looks like. I've seen what happens when someone is dragged along asphalt while their brain matter pours out of their head, when skin is stripped away, when the body stops looking like a person and starts looking like something broken beyond recognition. Those images don't fade. They don't soften with time. They just sit there, waiting to surface when you least expect them. Most of it blurs together now. Not because it didn't matter, but because there was so much of it. Too much. Your brain can't keep every horror separate. So it stacks them on top of each other until they become one heavy mass of memory. But there's one incident that never blurred. It sticks with me more than the others, even though, objectively, I'd seen worse. More bodies, more destruction, more suffering. But this one stays sharp. It was 2007 in the Ubaidi district of Baghdad. There was a high school-aged girl who lived behind our FOB. She wasn't involved in anything political or military. She wasn't fighting anyone. She was just a girl living her life in a place that had turned deadly. Someone decided to kill her. They shot her from the back of her head, and the bullet exited through both of her eyes. Exactly like a scene from the movie Boondock Saints. That detail is what still makes me feel sick. Not just that she was murdered, but that someone thought about how to do it. That they remembered a movie scene and decided to recreate it on a real human being. A little girl, someone's daughter. Someone who had dreams, friends, a future that was stolen in an instant. Some actual person stood there and thought, I'm going to kill this girl, and I'm going to do it like that scene I saw in a movie. That thought alone is horrifying. It means she wasn't just killed out of anger or fear or impulse. There was intent, creativity, a kind of detached cruelty that treats life like entertainment. I remember standing there afterward, I looking at what was left of her, and feeling something inside me break in a quiet way. Not an explosion of emotion, just a dull, heavy realization of how far gone things were, how completely warped people's minds had become. That was a real human being, and she was reduced to a reference, a reenactment, a moment of someone else's twisted imagination. People talk about dehumanization in war, but this is what it really looks like. When killing stops being about necessity or survival and starts being about performance, about messages, about cruelty for its own sake. I know there are people out there who've seen worse. I know some of the stories here are even more extreme. I don't try to compete for most messed up experiences. That's not the point. This wasn't about being the worst thing that's ever happened. It was about how it affected me. It was messed up to me. It still is. Because once you see things like that, you can't fully go back to the person you were before. Your understanding of humanity changes. Your sense of safety changes. Your idea of what people are capable of changes. You start to realize that there are people who don't see others as people at all, who can look at a child and see an object, a symbol, or a prop in a story they're telling themselves. And you also realize how fragile life is in places where law, stability, and accountability have collapsed. How quickly everything can turn into chaos. How easily violence becomes routine. What stays with me isn't just the blood or the bodies. It's the casualness. The way these killings were woven into daily life. The way people learned to look away because looking too closely could get you killed too. It's the fear that sat under everything. The knowledge that anyone could be next. That there was no logic you could rely on to keep yourself or others safe. And sometimes, late at night, what comes back isn't even the images themselves. It's the thoughts, the questions. How does someone reach a point where killing a child like that feels acceptable? How many people walked past her house, saw her, spoke to her, laughed with her, never knowing how her life would end? How many others died the same way, without anyone remembering their names? These aren't questions with answers. They're just weight you carry. I've learned that trauma doesn't always come from the biggest explosion or the most dramatic moment. Sometimes it comes from one quiet realization that cuts deeper than anything else. For me, that realization was understanding that there were people who could take inspiration from a movie and apply it to real life, without hesitation, without remorse. That's something you don't unsee. I don't expect people to fully understand what it's like to live with these memories. I don't even expect them to make sense. I just know that they're there, and they shaped me whether I wanted them to or not. I know I don't win any contest for worst story, and that's fine. This isn't about ranking pain. It's about acknowledging that it was real, that it mattered, and that it left a mark. Because even now, far away from Baghdad, far away from those streets in those days, that girl's face still comes back to me sometimes. And when it does, it reminds me of just how thin the line is between ordinary life and absolute horror, and how easily humans can cross it. This is one of those memories that doesn't fade with time. It doesn't soften or blur at the edges. If anything, it stays sharp, replaying itself in your mind when you least expect it. Not because you want to remember it, but because your brain refuses to let it go. It's tied to sound, to instinct, to that moment when you realize life has crossed the line you can never uncross. It started quietly, which somehow makes it worse. My brother and I were texting, like we always did. Nothing dramatic at first, just messages back and forth. But something felt off almost immediately. The things he was saying didn't sound like him. The tone was strange, unsettling in a way that's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. His words felt heavy, dark, like they were carrying something underneath them that he wasn't fully saying out loud. Earlier that same week, he had told me he was having suicidal thoughts. That alone should have set off every alarm in my head, and in some ways it did. I was scared. But fear doesn't always turn into the right action. Sometimes it turns into denial, or rationalizing, or hoping things aren't as bad as they sound. I told myself he was just in a bad mental space, that he needed to vent, that talking about it was better than bottling it up. I thought being there for him, listening, responding calmly, was the right thing to do. I assumed he was safe. The next day, the messages continued, and they were still wrong. Same kind of wording. Same heavy, uncomfortable feeling when I read them. It felt like he was circling something without naming it directly. I asked him how he was feeling. I asked if he needed to talk. I tried to open the door wider to let him know I was there. He responded for a little while. Then nothing. No reply, no explanation. just silence. At first I told myself he was busy, or asleep, or needed space. That's what you do when you don't want to imagine the worst. You fill the silence with reasonable excuses. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You wait. But the waiting didn't feel normal. The silence stretched on, and the unease in my chest kept growing. I checked my phone over and over. I reread the last messages, looking for something I might have missed. Something obvious that I should have taken more seriously. The longer he didn't respond, the louder my thoughts became. He still lived at my parents' house. That fact kept echoing in my head. He wasn't alone somewhere far away. He was there, and under the same roof as our parents. And yet something felt very wrong. Eventually, I couldn't sit with it anymore. I called my dad. I told him I was worried. I said my brother had stopped responding to me, and that the things he'd been saying felt off. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I'm sure some of the fear slipped through. I expected my dad to reassure me, to say my brother was fine, maybe asleep, maybe in his room. I expected calm. Instead, my dad handed the phone to my mom. That should have been my first real clue that something was wrong. My mom came on the line, and she started talking to me like everything was normal. Small talk, casual conversation. The kind of surface-level chatter people use when they're trying to keep things together. I remember thinking it was strange, but I didn't question it. I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Then I heard it. In the background, my dad screaming my brother's name. At first, it sounded annoyed, like a parent calling out to a child who isn't responding. There was irritation in it, impatience. The kind of tone that says, "Answer me." But almost immediately, that sound changed. It turned into desperation. Pure, raw desperation. My dad kept yelling my brother's name, louder each time. The annoyance vanished, replaced by panic so intense you could hear it breaking through his voice. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't measured. It was the sound of a father realizing something was terribly wrong and trying, with everything he had, to undo it. That sound went straight through me. I don't even remember what my mom was saying anymore. Her voice faded into the background as my entire focus locked onto my dad's screams. Time slowed down in a way that feels unreal when I think about it now. Every second stretched, heavy and suffocating. I knew. Before anyone said the words, before anything was confirmed, I knew. Your body knows things before your mind is ready to accept them. My chest felt tight. My hands went numb. My thoughts scattered, unable to form anything coherent. All I could hear was my dad calling out my brother's name, like if he said it enough times, reality would change. That sound will be with me forever. There are moments in life that become markers, dividing everything into before and after. This was one of them. The person I was before hearing my father scream like that doesn't exist anymore. Something shifted permanently in that instant. I remember sitting there, phone pressed to my ear, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly, just listening. Every scream felt like a blow. Every pause between them felt even worse, because it left space for imagination to run wild. I kept thinking about the texts, about the things my brother had said, about how I'd assumed he was just venting, about how I'd told myself it wasn't urgent. The guilt started creeping in immediately, sharp and relentless. What if I'd pushed harder? What if I'd called sooner? What if I'd driven over? What if I'd taken his words more seriously instead of trying to be calm and supportive? Your brain does this to you. It rewrites the past with impossible expectations. It convinces you that you should have known exactly what to do, even though at the time you were doing the best you could with the information you had. But logic doesn't stand a chance against grief. I don't remember exactly how the call ended. I don't remember who hung up or what was said next. That part is blurry, like my mind protected itself by refusing to record every detail. What I do remember is the sound, the tone, the way my dad's voice broke as it shifted from frustration to terror. It wasn't just yelling, it was begging. It was the sound of a parent facing the unthinkable. After that moment, everything moved too fast and too slow at the same time. Conversations happened that didn't feel real. Decisions were made that felt automatic. People spoke to me and I responded. But it was like I was watching myself from a distance. And underneath it all was that sound looping in my head. The thing about moments like this is that they don't just hurt in one way. They fracture you in layers. There's the shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming sadness, but there's also the guilt, the anger, the confusion, the endless questions that have no answers. You start replaying every interaction you've ever had with your brother, every joke, every argument, every missed call. You search for signs, patterns, anything that could explain how things reached this point. And when you can't find clear answers, your mind turns inward and blames you instead. I keep thinking about how normal everything seemed, right up until it wasn't. We were just texting. A normal, everyday thing, something people do without thinking. There was no dramatic goodbye, no clear final message. Just words that felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully articulate at the time. That's what makes it so hard. Suicidal thoughts don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they hide in vague language, in tired phrasing, in offhand comments that sound like venting. Sometimes they come wrapped in humor, or resignation, or silence. And when you're close to someone, it can be incredibly hard to accept that they might actually be in danger. You want to believe they'll be okay. You want to believe tomorrow will look different. I also think about my parents constantly, about my dad, and that sound he made, about my mom trying to keep things normal on the phone while chaos erupted behind her, about what it must have been like for them in that house, in that moment, realizing they were losing their child. There is no pain that compares to that, and there is no way to prepare for it. Even now, long after that day, certain sounds can bring it all back. Someone raising their voice, someone calling out a name in panic. Even certain tones of frustration can twist my stomach because they remind me of how quickly annoyance can turn into terror. That moment taught me something brutal about life, that everything can change in seconds. That the people you love most can slip away even when you're trying to be there for them. That good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, and that grief doesn't follow a straight line. It comes in waves. Sometimes it's quiet and manageable. Sometimes it crashes over you without warning, leaving you gasping for air. I still think about the silence between his messages, about how empty my phone felt when there was no reply, about how that silence turned into the loudest sound I've ever heard, coming from my father's throat. That contrast alone feels unbearable. People often talk about regret after something like this. And yes, regret exists. But it's more complicated than that. It's mixed with love and fear and the understanding that mental illness doesn't follow rules. You can do everything right and still lose someone. You can be present, caring, supportive, and still not be able to stop it. Knowing that doesn't erase the pain, but it matters. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that blaming yourself will slowly destroy you if you let it. The mind will keep offering you new ways to punish yourself, new scenarios where you imagine saving them. New versions of the past where you say the perfect thing at the perfect time. None of those versions are real. What's real is that I loved my brother. that I tried to be there for him, that I took his pain seriously, even if I didn't understand the full depth of it in time. And what's real is that one sound, one moment, one scream will stay with me for the rest of my life. Not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a reminder of how deeply human we are, how fragile, and how much love can exist alongside unimaginable loss. I wish I could forget that sound, but I can't, and maybe I shouldn't, because it reminds me that behind every statistic, every story, every headline about suicide, there are families, siblings, parents, frozen in moments like that. Moments where the world splits open and nothing is ever the same again. That sound wasn't just my dad calling my brother's name. It was the sound of love colliding with helplessness. And once you hear that, it never really leaves you. I've thought about this moment more times than I can count. And the strange thing is that it didn't feel terrifying when it happened. Not in the way horror usually announces itself. There was no scream, no obvious violence, no clear signal that something awful might be unfolding. It felt ordinary. That's what makes it so unsettling now, looking back at it with adult eyes and understanding. I was young, still a kid myself, at a park with one of my siblings. It was one of those normal days that blend together in childhood memory. The kind of day where nothing feels important enough to remember in detail. The park wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. Just a typical neighborhood park, swings, grass, maybe a small play structure, and the steady background noise of traffic from nearby streets. The adjacent school was right there, too, close enough that you could see its buildings and fences from where we were sitting. We were doing whatever kids do to pass time. Talking, wandering, probably bored in that comfortable way where boredom isn't yet something you try to escape. I remember feeling safe. That's important. There was no sense of danger at all. At some point, a group of kids rode past the park on their bikes. They weren't doing anything unusual, just riding together, laughing, moving fast in that loose, uncoordinated way kids do when they're enjoying themselves. They looked like kids from the neighborhood or maybe from the nearby school. Nothing about them stood out as strange or alarming. Then a car pulled up near the school. I noticed it, but only in the casual way you notice cars when you're sitting outside. It wasn't speeding. It didn't screech to a halt. It just pulled up and stopped. I watched as the kids on bikes went over to it and got inside. That was it. No struggle, no hesitation, no shouting. They just got in. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, not even a little. In my young mind, there were plenty of innocent explanations. Maybe it was one of their parents, maybe an older sibling, maybe someone they knew giving them a ride home. Adults pick kids up all the time. Cars pull up next to schools constantly. Nothing about it seemed wrong to me in that moment. I went back to whatever I was doing, and the image slipped into the background of my attention. A few minutes later, everything changed. A middle-aged woman rode up to the park on a bike. I remember her movement more than anything else. She wasn't casually pedaling. She was rushing. Her body language was frantic, unsteady, and like she was barely holding herself together. She stopped abruptly, almost skidding to a halt, and looked at us with an expression I didn't fully understand at the time. She was crying. Not quietly, not politely. She was openly panicked, tears streaming down her face, breath uneven. Her voice shook when she spoke. She asked us if we had seen kids on bikes, and if so, where they had gone. Even as a child, I could tell something was very wrong. There was a kind of fear in her that doesn't come from small problems. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't irritation. It was raw, overwhelming panic. The kind that takes over your entire body and leaves no room for anything else. I froze. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what she wanted from me. I didn't understand the situation well enough to put it into words. All I could do was point in the direction where I had last seen the car pull up near the school. I remember her face when I did. It changed instantly. Her fear sharpened into something even more intense. Worry mixed with dread, like confirmation of something she had been afraid of already. She didn't thank us. She didn't stop to ask more questions. She just took off in that direction, pedaling hard, her posture tense, her whole body focused on one goal. And then she was gone. The park went quiet again, at least on the surface. The swing still moved. The air still felt the same. But something had shifted, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. I was very young, too young to fully understand what might have been happening. I didn't connect all the dots. I didn't think about kidnapping or abduction or worst-case scenarios. Those ideas weren't part of my world yet. I just knew that a woman had been desperately looking for children, and the children I'd seen had gotten into a car and disappeared. At the time, I think my brain filed it away as a strange moment and moved on. But memories like this don't actually disappear. They wait. As I got older, that memory came back in pieces. Not all at once. Just flashes. The kids on bikes. The car. The woman's face. The way she cried. The way she didn't even hesitate when I pointed. And with age came understanding. I started to realize how wrong that situation might have been. How easily something terrible could have happened, or already had. How that moment, which felt so small and unimportant at the time, might have been one of those turning points in someone else's life. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know if the woman found the kids. I don't know if the car was stopped. I don't know if it was all a misunderstanding or something far darker. That uncertainty is part of what makes this memory so haunting. There is no resolution, no ending, just a question mark that my mind keeps returning to. Sometimes I hope it was nothing. I hope it was a relative giving kids a ride without telling their parent. I hope it was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by panic. I hope the woman found them safe and hugged them and went home relieved. But sometimes my mind goes to darker places. I think about how easy it is for children to trust adults. How easy it is for something dangerous to look normal from the outside. A car pulling up near a school doesn't raise alarms. Kids getting into a car doesn't look dramatic. It looks like everyday life. That's what scares me now. There were no obvious warning signs. No red flags waving in the air. If something bad did happen, it didn't look like a crime in progress. It looked like a normal afternoon. I also think about myself in that moment. About how little I understood. About how I didn't think to tell another adult. How I didn't call for help or question anything. Not because I didn't care, but because I was a child and didn't know better. That realization brings a strange mix of guilt and sadness. Guilt, even though I know logically it wasn't my responsibility. Sadness because it shows how vulnerable children are, not just the ones taken, but the ones who witness things they can't fully process. As an adult, I know that the woman's reaction wasn't random. Parents don't panic like that unless something is very wrong. Her fear was specific. She was looking for children who had been on bikes. That means she already knew they were missing. She already knew something wasn't right. And the timing still bothers me. The kids got into the car. A few minutes later, she was desperately searching. That gap feels important. Too short to be coincidence. It suggests she realized very quickly that something was wrong. Every time I revisit this memory, I wonder if I could have done more, even as a kid. Could I have described the car better? Could I have noticed the license plate? Could I have run after her and tried to explain more clearly? But then I remind myself that I was young, that I didn't have the tools or awareness to handle something like that, that adults are supposed to protect children, not the other way around. What stays with me most is how normal everything felt right up until it didn't. There was no dramatic buildup, no sense of impending doom, just a quiet shift from ordinary to terrifying, marked by one woman's panic cutting through an otherwise calm afternoon. It changed how I see the world, even now. I don't assume things are harmless just because they look that way. I pay more attention to small details. I trust my instincts more, especially when something feels off, but I can't immediately explain why. And I think about how many moments like this happen every day. Moments where something important passes through someone's field of vision and then disappears. Moments where the outcome is decided just beyond what anyone can see. That's the part that really stays with me. The idea that something horrific might have happened, or almost happened. And I was there, close enough to see part of it, but too young to understand the full picture. Close enough to remember it forever, but far enough away to never know the truth. I hope more than anything that those kids were okay. I hope the woman found them. I hope it was all resolved. I hope my imagination is worse than reality. But even if it was, that moment taught me something lasting. That danger doesn't always announce itself. That the scariest things often look ordinary. And that sometimes the most chilling memories aren't the ones where you saw something terrible happen, but the ones where you might have seen the beginning of it, without ever knowing how it ended. This is one of those stories that doesn't sound frightening at first. There's no obvious villain, no crime, no cruelty, no intent to harm. And yet, the more you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because it shows how suddenly and randomly life can turn dangerous. How something ordinary can slip into something almost fatal without warning. It's the kind of story that stays with you not because of how dramatic it is, but because of how easily it could have happened to anyone. My mom's girlfriend used to work at a veterinary clinic. I don't remember exactly what her job title was. She might have been a tech, an assistant, or something similar, but honestly, that detail doesn't really matter. What matters is that she was around animals every day. She was used to them, comfortable with them. This wasn't someone unfamiliar with claws, teeth, or unpredictable behavior. Animals acting out was just part of the job. That's what makes what happened even more disturbing. One day, while she was at work, a bird tried to perch on her finger. I think it was a parrot, or at least some kind of large bird with strong claws. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Birds perch on people all the time. It's usually harmless, even kind of cute. Just one of those small, everyday moments that happens when you work with animals. But this bird didn't just perch. It dug its claws into her finger. Not lightly. Not in a brief, startled way. It latched on and started gripping hard, its claws sinking into her skin. Anyone who's ever seen a parrot's feet knows how strong they are. They're designed to grip branches tightly, to hold their weight, to never let go unless they choose to. When those claws press into human skin, it's not like a cat scratch. It's deep, sharp, painful. At first it was probably just painful and alarming, but still manageable. Things like that happen in vet clinics. Animals panic. They react. You deal with it and move on. But when someone tried to take the bird off her finger, things got worse. The bird panicked. Instead of loosening its grip, it clamped down harder. Its claws dug in deeper, tearing skin. The movement, the stress, the struggle all escalated the situation. What had been a manageable injury suddenly became much more serious. Blood started coming out. And not just a little. Eventually, they managed to get the bird off. By then, her finger was badly injured. She went to clean the wound, probably doing what anyone would do. She ran it under water, trying to rinse the blood away, trying to assess how bad it really was. But that's when something unexpected happened. She fainted. It wasn't because of the pain. It wasn't because of the bird. It was because she saw the blood. Some people have a strong reaction to the sight of blood, even if they work in medical or animal care environments. It's not logical. It's not something you can control. The body just shuts down. Blood pressure drops, vision narrows, and suddenly you're not standing anymore. She lost consciousness. And when she fell, she didn't fall forward or sideways in a way that might have been less dangerous. She fell straight backward. Her head hit the floor. The back of her skull cracked against it with full force. That's the moment where everything changes. That's the moment where a simple workplace accident becomes something life-threatening. The kind of moment that happens in less than a second, but alters everything that comes after. Head injuries are terrifying because they don't always look dramatic right away. There's no immediate understanding of how severe they are. You can't see what's happening inside the skull. You don't know what's bleeding, what's swelling, what's being damaged. She was taken to the hospital. At first, the people there didn't fully understand what was wrong. That's another thing that makes this story unsettling. Even professionals didn't immediately grasp the extent of the damage. She was conscious, but something was clearly off. She couldn't speak properly. Her words didn't come out right. She couldn't communicate clearly what she was feeling or what had happened. That's a terrifying place to be. Imagine being injured, scared, confused, and unable to properly explain yourself. Imagine knowing something is very wrong with your own mind, but not being able to put it into words. That kind of helplessness is hard to even picture. The problem was brain damage. The impact had caused serious trauma inside her skull. There was swelling, pressure, damage that couldn't be fixed with rest or time alone. As doctors monitored her, it became clear that this wasn't something minor. This wasn't a concussion that would pass in a few days. She needed surgery, brain surgery, and not the kind that's routine or low risk. This was dangerous. Any surgery involving the brain carries serious risk. There's the risk of infection, the risk of bleeding, the risk of losing function, the risk of never waking up, the risk of dying on the table. And the terrifying part is that sometimes, even if the surgery goes well, the person who comes out afterward is not the same as the person who went in. She could have died. That wasn't an exaggeration. That wasn't a distant possibility. It was very real. The kind of risk that forces families to prepare themselves for the worst, even while hoping desperately for the best. She went through with the surgery. She survived. But survival doesn't always mean full recovery. From what I understand, she did make it through, but she wasn't completely untouched by what happened. Brain injuries have a way of lingering, even when someone looks fine on the outside, even when they can walk, talk, and function. There can still be problems beneath the surface. I'm not entirely sure of the details, but I believe she still has some issues occasionally. Maybe with speech, maybe with memory, maybe with processing, maybe with headaches or balance or fatigue. Brain damage doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up in subtle, frustrating ways that only the person living with it truly understands. And all of this happened because of a bird. Not an attack, not violence, not recklessness, just a chain of small, ordinary events lining up in the worst possible way. A bird perching, claws digging in, blood, a faint, a fall. Each step on its own might not have been catastrophic, but together, they nearly ended a life. That's what makes this story so unsettling to me. There's no lesson about being careful in dangerous places. No moral about avoiding bad people. No warning signs that would have told anyone this was coming. It was just a normal workday that turned into a medical nightmare in seconds. It also highlights how fragile the human body really is. We walk around assuming our skulls protect us, that falling isn't that dangerous, that accidents are something we recover from. But the truth is, one bad fall, one wrong angle, one hard surface, and everything can change. What sticks with me the most is how quickly control was lost. She didn't choose to faint. She didn't choose how she fell. She didn't choose where her head landed. And once it happened, there was no undoing it. The people at the hospital, not fully understanding what was wrong at first, makes it even scarier. Because it shows how, even in a place designed to help, uncertainty can reign. How time passes while doctors try to piece things together. How minutes and hours matter when the brain's involved. And then there's the quiet aftermath. After the surgery, after the crisis, after the danger has passed. Life doesn't always snap back into place. There's no dramatic ending, no clear moment where everything is suddenly okay again. There's just adjustment, lingering effects, a new normal that no one asked for. For the people close to her, it must have been terrifying to watch. To see someone go from a normal workday to struggling to speak, to know she could die because of something so random, to sit with that uncertainty while doctors worked and waited. This story doesn't scream horror in the traditional sense, but it absolutely is one. It's the horror of randomness, the horror of fragility, the horror of how fast life can tip over. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always come with warning signs or dramatic buildup. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an everyday moment, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already in the middle of it. Whenever I think about this, I find myself replaying it in my head, imagining how easily it could have gone the other way, how she could have died, how a completely different set of people would be telling a completely different story. All because a bird decided to grip a finger. It makes you look at ordinary life differently, at work days, at small accidents, at moments you'd usually shrug off, because sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we fear. They're the ones we never see coming. I didn't grow up in what most people would call a normal home. Until I was about 16 years old, I never actually lived in a house. My parents ran pubs, and because of that, we lived in them. Wherever the pub was, that was home. Bedrooms upstairs, bar, and public areas downstairs, and a constant background noise of footsteps, voices, and movement that you eventually learned to tune out. For most of my childhood, that was just life. It didn't feel strange because it was all I knew. We moved a lot. New pubs, new towns, new buildings, each one with its own quirks. Old floors that creaked no matter how gently you walked. Cellars that always felt colder than they should. Corridors that echoed even when no one was there. Most of them were old buildings, some centuries old, and people would joke about them being haunted. I never paid much attention to that. When you grow up around places like that, you learn to shrug things off. Drafts, bad wiring, weird noises at night. There's always a logical explanation if you don't look too closely. The last pub my parents ran was different. Even now, years later, thinking about that place makes my skin prickle. At the time, I didn't have the words for it, but there was a constant feeling that something wasn't right. Not dramatic, not jump scare terrifying, just wrong. Like the building itself was paying attention. Little things started happening almost immediately after we moved in. Things that were easy to dismiss on their own, but impossible to ignore when they kept stacking up. Objects would go missing, not misplaced, not forgotten, but gone. You'd put something down, walk away, come back minutes later, and it simply wouldn't be there. We'd search everywhere. Proper searches, tearing rooms apart, checking the same spots over and over again. Hours would pass. Then, eventually, the missing item would reappear in a place that had already been checked multiple times. Right out in the open, sitting there like it had never left. Anyone can brush that off. Memory is unreliable. People miss things, I get that. But when it happens again and again, with different people, different objects, in different rooms, you start to feel like you're being messed with. Like something is deliberately moving things just to remind you it can. One of the clearest and hardest to explain things involved a piece of furniture we had in one of the living areas upstairs. It was a Welsh dresser. For anyone who doesn't know, it's basically a set of cupboards at the bottom with shelving attached above. The shelves sit slightly back from the front edge of the cupboards. The cupboard itself was about 40 centimeters deep, just under 14 inches, and the shelves didn't overhang. Anything that fell straight down should have hit the top of the cupboard first. On those shelves, I kept gifts I'd received when I was christened. Small keepsakes, ornaments, things that had sentimental value but no real use. They'd been sitting there for years without any issues. Then one day, one of them flew off the shelf. I don't mean it slipped. I don't mean it slowly tipped and fell. It flew. It cleared the entire top of the cupboard without touching it and landed on the floor about a foot out from the front. That alone made no sense. Gravity doesn't work like that. Then it happened again and again. Different items, different times, always the same result. Off the shelf, no contact with the cupboard, landing well away from where they should have fallen. There was no vibration, no door slamming, no one nearby. Just the sound of something hitting the floor, followed by that awful realization that it shouldn't have been able to do that. Another incident happened late at night after the pub had closed. Everything downstairs was locked up. Doors bolted, lights off, alarm set. We were all upstairs, winding down for the night. The internal calling system suddenly went off. The system was used so staff could contact the living area if needed. There was absolutely no reason for it to activate when the pub was shut. My dad answered it. All he heard was the sound of the phone being physically dropped. That sound is unmistakable. Plastic hitting a hard floor. A hollow clatter, followed by silence. He told me about it immediately, and we both went downstairs together. Neither of us said much. We were already on edge, and when we reached the bar area, we found the phone on the floor, exactly where it would have landed if someone had dropped it from the counter. Then we noticed the fire exit. It was open, not unlocked. Open. The alarm hadn't gone off. No alerts, no signs of forced entry. The night air drifted in, cold and still, like it had been waiting. My dad checked the whole place, every room, every corner. No one was there. We locked everything back up and went upstairs without talking about it. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. When we first moved into the pub, my brother, who was younger than me at the time, spent about half an hour talking to someone who wasn't there. We were still settling in, the pub wasn't open yet, and the building was completely locked. He was sitting in one of the rooms, chatting away like he had company. When we asked him who he was talking to, he said it was a nice man in a brown coat. He didn't sound scared. He didn't sound confused. He sounded perfectly content, like this was a normal interaction. We asked where the man was, and my brother pointed as if the person was standing right there. No one else saw anything. Kids have imaginary friends. Everyone knows that. But something about the way he described this man stuck with us. The consistency, the calmness. He wasn't inventing games or adventures. He was just talking. Conversation, back and forth, like two people killing time. That stopped after a while. He never mentioned the man again. We didn't push it. One of the most unsettling things, and the one I still can't wrap my head around, happened in the kitchen. Our kitchen knives started getting damaged. Not chipped, not blunted. The tips were curling. And I mean curling. The metal at the very tip of the knife would bend over tightly, like someone had rolled it up from the corner, the same way you'd curl a piece of paper if you pinched it just right. It wasn't something you could do by accident. It wasn't wear and tear. It wasn't heat damage. These were solid kitchen knives, and the bends were extreme. We'd straighten them or replace them, and then it would happen again. Multiple knives. Same damage, same tight curl, no explanation. There were countless other things. Footsteps when everyone was accounted for. Doors that opened or closed on their own. The feeling of being watched, especially late at night. That sense that you weren't alone, even when you knew logically that you were. None of us ever saw anything clearly. No full apparitions. No dramatic figures standing at the end of the bed. It was subtler than that, and somehow more disturbing. Like whatever was there didn't need to show itself to make its presence known. It was content to push, to move, to interfere just enough to keep us uneasy. Living in that place wore you down, slowly. You didn't panic all the time. You just existed in a constant low-level tension. You listened more carefully. You double-checked things. You stopped trusting your own senses. When we finally moved out, it felt like leaving something behind that was watching us go. Stepping into a normal house for the first time in my life should have felt strange, but instead, it felt quiet in the best possible way. Empty, peaceful, neutral. Looking back now, I understand why people dismiss stories like this. I understand skepticism. If I hadn't lived it, I'd probably roll my eyes too. But when you experience that many things, over that long a period, with multiple witnesses, it changes you. You don't walk away believing in monsters or ghosts necessarily. You walk away knowing that there are things you don't understand, and that sometimes places remember more than they should. And that pub remembered us. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.